The When Time is the title that Martin Carter gave to a series of poems that appeared in his 1977 collection, Poems of Succession. In 1969, C.L.R. James wrote to Martin Carter saying, "I hope you have not entirely abandoned the writing of poetry." But James needn't have worried. Carter was discussing a new collection with John LaRose, the Trinidadian writer, publisher and activist who was based in London and had founded the New Beacon Bookshop and a publishing house. In 1970, they agreed that New Beacon would publish a retrospective edition of Carter's work. Aubrey Williams delivered the manuscript and was ready to design the cover for the new book. In the end, he didn't do this because Carter preferred a plain red rust cover, the one that we know today. At the time, Carter liked the idea of presenting his poems in reverse chronological order. So the collection was to be titled Deeds 1970 to 1950, or just Poems 1970 to 1950. And then 5 years passed and no publication came. Things got back on track when Carter came to England as a visiting fellow at the University of Essex. And by this time, there were a lot more poems to include. There may also have been another possible title. In his 1976 diary, alongside the address of New Beacon Books, he wrote in capital letters, Poems of Revision. But nothing came of this other title, and in 1977, Poems of Succession was published, and the When Time included with it, making up almost a third of the collection. The phrase, the When Time, is also really striking. Time, we know, is very important in Carter's poetic vocabulary. It's the focalizing present in the poem, This is the Dark Time, My Love, a poem describing the collective moment of oppression. In Death of a Slave, Carter writes these words, "Time plants the seeds of anger." And here time is something like the accumulating experiences or memory of a traumatic past. In the first poem of Poems of Affinity, Carter uses the almost proverb-like words, "The more men of our time we are, the more our time is." And Carter was always attuned to the moment he was living in and its potential. And he was also, I think, equally attuned to our potential to live up to or to betray the times that we live in. So why is the phrase "the when time" so striking? Well, I think that's partly because it feels like a phrase that has multiple origins and multiple meanings. It has the creative power of Creole to forge meaning out of combined words. So the words when and time reinforce each other into a compound phrase. And it makes us wonder what then defines this when time. What's so special about this kind of time? The title also encourages us to dwell on the meaning and uses of the word when. I think what we might say is that the when time frames all of Carter's poems in a really challenging and open way. And it's for us to think about those potential meanings rather than for us to kind of define a particular way of understanding the phrase. What we get in this sequence of poems are linguistic experiments, poems of discovery, poems of loss, love, and solidarity, poems that are locatable within, but maybe not confined to Guyanese society. In these poems, we find Carter experimenting with writing about himself, about people, about places, to create a collection that I think is defined by the complicated affiliations we have to our shared times. Carter's poem Proem provides an aptly puzzling preface to his poetry. The word proem means introduction to a larger work, and it comes from Greek and Latin, and in classical poetry, it might be used as an invocation to the muses and to act as a guide to readers. But what exactly does Carter's proem introduce or invoke? Its varied publishing histories, I think, are worth considering. It was first published with the title Ever With Me in 1974 in Gizra, the newsletter of the Guyana Institute for Social Research and Action. It was then republished in Poems of Succession with the title Proem, and it was the first poem to that whole collection. In the first edition of Carter's selected poems, this was repeated and it was introducing the whole collection. In the second edition of selected poems, it's the final poem in the When time. And in the collected poems that I edited, it's included as the first poem of the When time to mark its introductory status. But I still wonder whether this decision limits the poem as Carter conceived it. Of course, we should remember that this poem didn't begin its life as Proem, but as Ever With Me. And we could read the poem alongside a short article that Carter published in Gizra in the same year, 1974. And he wrote this: "To want to be a poet and try to be one, and to participate in politics, which is what all of us do, whether we realize it or not, is to try to have more life, to deepen the relations we have with each other, to explore one's own and each other's capacity to respond to those challenges of being and mind we issue as we exist." Carter saw poetry and politics as congruent, finding consistency in their ambitions. Titled Apart from Both, another riddling title, Carter sees politics as another way of describing social action, social organisation, something that no one can opt out of. Poetry is different, it's something to be strived for, but both poetry and politics are founded in an effort to try to have more life, he says. And there's more, I think. Both are linked by a focus on relationships and on a curiosity to understand ourselves and each other. Proem or Ever With Me opens with the words, "Not in the saying of you are you said." Tightly composed in 13 lines and one line short of a sonnet, the poem encourages us to think about articulation, identity, mutability, collaboration. The poem isn't a refusal to write, but an admission that representation will never be complete. The you in the poem can never be fully expressed. We could also remember the interests of the Guyana Institute for Social Research and Action. Founded by the Jesuit Father Michael Campbell Johnston, Gizra's work can be seen as part of a larger movement in the 1970s of liberation theology. That Carter chose this poem to share with Gizra readers might encourage us to read it in the context of the twinned concerns of spirituality and social justice. So ever since its publication in Gizra, Carter's lines have been an open invitation to understand the nature of relation.
Proem. Not in the saying of you are you said. Baffled and like a root stopped by a stone, you turn back questioning the tree you feed. But what the leaves hear is not what the roots ask. Inexhaustibly, being at one time what was to be said, and at another time what has been said, the saying of you remains the living of you, never to be said. But enduring, you change with the change that changes, and yet are not of the changing of any of you. Ever yourself, you are always about to be yourself in something else ever with me.
Strong memory, bright pressure of a hand more eloquent than any broken phrase. I contemplate love's furious argument, knowing for certain no one ever wins. Counting the days since I last spoke with you, I wonder whether words out of a mouth are less than silence. or if silences tell more than declarations make obscure. And how a question such as this is answered, I merely ponder, since the heart of passion can summon dreams, abolish conundrums, all to endure the dark length of a day.
In a Georgetown journal, Andrew Salkey wrote about meeting Martin Carter, who was then Minister of Information and Culture. And Salkey said this: Carter's words were tellingly chosen. His person, a gentle, tall, big man, a poet who may yet do a very serious injury to the sterile vocabulary and syntax of bureaucracy. He continued, I felt then that if he did succeed in giving something new to the style of his particular ministerial responsibility, not only would it subvert the standard image of the other ministries for the better, but he would have emerged as the pioneer rediscoverer of the long-lost beating heart in anybody's politics. So Salkey suggests that Carter's poetic sensibilities might be able to shift to alter Guyanese and regional politics. It was an ambitious thought, and not long after they met, Carter resigned as a minister. After his resignation, Carter returned to Booker's, and this made front-page news. The period also marked a return to publishing poetry, which Carter hadn't done or hadn't visibly been involved in when he was a minister. The first poem that was published was called Occasion, and many of us know it much better as A Mouth is Always Muzzled. It appeared in Georgetown's Sunday Graphic in early 1971 and was then again published in the magazine Savaku. And the poem was quickly interpreted as a statement on Carter's resignation. He consistently denied that there was an intentional link, describing it to me as, quote, a general statement, and arguing that he had written it before, he said, a long time before his resignation. The poem squarely faces the barriers to truthful expression. So we have the famous line, a mouth is always muzzled by the food it eats to live. And we move from ideas of being muzzled or silenced to the idea of life as a question that all of us have to answer. And the importance of questions and questioning are so constant in Carter's writing. In his notes, he returned to these final lines with the additional thought, writing this: poetry, a way of surviving. If life is the question asking what is the way to die, poetry is the question asking what is the way to live.
A mouth is always muzzled. Martin Carter. In the premises of the tongue dwells the anarchy of the ear. In the chaos of the vision, resolution of the purpose. And would shout it out differently if it could be sounded plain. But a mouth is always muzzled by the food it eats to live. Rain was the cause of roofs. Birth was the cause of beds, but life is the question asking, what is the way to die?
The poem for Milton Williams by Martin Carter. The map I study has one continent, though many seas and just as many skies. And so before the final murder is done, let me locate the country of the act. Places I barely thought of, you know well. Rivers that flow up mountains are to you what streets are there. Inevitable pathways, inviting naked feet to run away. Milton, you are a splinter in my mind, a flint of glass lodged in a closed eyelid. You make the trigger image reset old time bombs fused with memory and tears. And the last to mend the shoes to fit your feet was thrown away as rubbish. It was lost, as other things are in the normal fashion: a map, a ring, a letter, or a man. In the 1950s, Milton was a close friend of Martin. I knew Milton as well. He's a very fine young man, very quiet, introspective. He used to like to walk around in the Botanic Gardens. And in the late 50s, he left. In the late 50s, he left to go to England. Traveled by boat, arrived at Liverpool. Didn't have money for a ticket, so he asked what was the direction to go to London. And so he started to walk on the railway lines. So somebody stopped him, and they were able to purchase a ticket for him to get to London. And so he got to London. When he came in 1972 to attend Carifesta as a guest of the government, because Martin was then Minister of Culture. His poems actually were published by People Tree Press.
If It Were Given by Martin Carter. If it were given to me, I would have had a serious conversation with the fertile dial of the clock of the sun. But then I admit I would have had to change the language of the dead. I would have had to haunt the cemetery where the living believe they put away the varnished coffins which mock them into making wreaths for themselves, and graveyards for their passions, and victories that mean nothing to them, though they win the trophy of life. That cupped hand of anguish, open for love, but scattering pain like seeds of paddy in the murdering drought.
For me, one of the most striking poems in the sequence of the When time is the poem for Angela Davis. Dated 1971, it praises the revolutionary work of the activist and attempts to explain her importance within the poet's life. At the time, Angela Davis was known in the USA and beyond as an academic, a member of the Communist Party of the United States, a feminist activist within the Black Power movement, and briefly a member of the Black Panthers. She was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list and arrested in 1970 after going into hiding, charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy for her alleged involvement in an attempt to free the imprisoned Soledad brothers. Davis was accused of having bought guns that would later be used. Although imprisoned for 16 months awaiting trial, Davis was acquitted of all charges. But we learn none of this from Carter's poem. Written before her acquittal, it is, quote, the power of love that Carter emphasizes. And this was not a disavowal of the politics of race and class, but an extended metaphor about the importance of the activist work that Davis is involved in. In the central verse, the metaphor of growth stretches in multiple directions. On one reading, Davis is, quote, the passionate tree, whose watered roots link hand to fruit and fruit to the promise of our prayerful hope. Or perhaps she's rain, the happy consequences of clouds, writes Carter, who helps to nurture the passionate trees. Gratitude, promises, and prayerful hope are what Davis's power of love generate. What is clear is Carter's interests in interconnections, in relationships, and in what he calls, quote, the triumph of the effort. But the Garden of Eden is also here in this poem, reminding us of failures, of fallibility, and structures of power. In the poem, Carter sees Davis's life-affirming work as countering that hemisphere of my mind where little else happens. Inaction is set along action in this poem, but throughout the poem, rain, something non-human, is given a regenerative role. It begins the poem with the lines, rain blazes, jolting the poetic voice to think of Angela Davis. Rain is that generating environmental force of growth, and in the final stanza, it's also central to a hopeful covenant that Carter writes. What I want to do is to command the drying pools of rain to wet your tired feet and lift your face. Here in the cyclical everyday aftermath of tropical rain, we get a power to restore and connect human endeavour across the Americas and beyond. The ritual bathing of feet that crosses so many cultures might recall Yoruba practice of washing the bride's feet before she enters her new home, or Jesus washing the feet of the apostles. Or you might think of the woman in the book of Luke who washes Jesus's feet, or Kevat washing Rama's feet before crossing the Ganges, or any number of daily acts of cleansing and ablution. What Carter focuses on is a human connection, which is at the same time a connection to nature, linking the human to the land and into the cosmos. His wish to be able to command in this poem is not a wish for power in itself, but to offer a collective comfort and solidarity.
For Angela Davis. Rain blazes in that hemisphere of my mind where little else happens, neither sunshine nor cloudburst, and certainly not the blossoming of the power of love you cherish, which so much overwhelms my tongue given to speech in the necessary workplaces where freedom is obscene. And from a drab window falls the happy consequence of clouds, which the roots of passionate trees receive with splendid gratitude, and which may return to us all in their time and in their special ways, linking hand to fruit and fruit to the promise of our prayerful hope and love, and the triumph of the effort of the always beating pulse in the wrist and temple of the architect who wars. I am thinking about you, Angela Davis. I am thinking about you, and what I want to do is to command the drying pools of rain to wet your tired feet and lift your face to the gift of the roof of clouds we owe you. Cuyuni. Inside my listening sleep, a roar of water on stubborn rock was the whisper of blood in the womb of my mother. And when I awoke, I began listening again. Why does water, ever running water of the river, never pause to take a rest on the back of rocks, or even on that place God has designed for it, out of the violent marriage of sun and rain and wind and the birth and death of trees, labor of roots, growing beneath the seeking upward face of the ever-yielding water,
which hides the testicles of seasons in its own and my groin. It is for this reason, and certain others, I have decided to have only an acquaintance with this ever-dropping, ever-racing river, and to speak of it in a code few can measure nearly. And the unbelievable conclusion is not an ending, but a closing of lips. And to talk about it openly in common places may well provoke its fury, and in that fury liberate one of its many demons, and send his anger roaming the void for me. So then, if perhaps, in some stupid fit of arrogance, I said something any fool can understand, and this river heard me and decided on vengeance, where is one who could give me weapons I shall be able to use? If any of you can, I shall be willing to take the risk. But I must warn you, if good advices prove as useless as a paddle in the falls, you will be happy to be transformed as much as I will have to, by the side of this menacing, sullen river, at the mercy of the swing of Hawkside, and far from the noise of language, where gods still live and brood on thrones of rock.
In a small city at dusk. In a small city at dusk, it is difficult to distinguish bird from bat. Both fly fast, one away from the dark, and one toward the dark. The bird to a nest in the tree, the bat to a feast in its branches. Stranger to each other, they seek, planted by beak or claw or hand, the same tree that grows out of the great soil. And I know, even before I came to live here, before the city had so many houses, dusk did the same to bird and bat, and does the same to man.
And I grope. Light waves like a field of grains of hair. In the quick life of a flying bird, wings are hollow bones where wind penetrates. The eyes of statues blink in stony unbelief. Where I wanted to walk, I could not. The native and other ways merge as destiny steeps. Rain drips like tears from the sudden eyes of a blind child. And I grope with the delicate touch of a god or a ghost.
My hand in yours. As in sleep, my hand in yours, yours in mine, your voice in my hearing and memory, like the sound of stars as they shine, not content with light only. My fingertips walk on your face gently. They tiptoe, as a dream does, away from sleep into waking. In a tree somewhere, a bird calls out, and I wake up, my hand still in yours, in the midst of the sound of stars and a far bird.
The Leaves of the Canna Lily by Martin Carter. The leaves of the canna lily near the pavement tremble like my own fingers, and the torn edges of the cloud in the sky are ragged like the lips of an idiot child. To walk the street, the man whose heart is whole must never care, must never try to wonder why the leaves of the canna lily or the edges of the cloud tremble like his own fingers, or stay ragged like the lips of his own mouth. And it would be so good if we could learn that while death is the final thing, it is most likely a worse destiny to be damned to live forever. For it came to me once in a sudden enlightenment that all of us, having once been born, can never die, can never choose the kind of sleep we dream of, or recognize awake. So this is partly why every day the chance comes to jump over the bridge or watch the carcass of the sun. The canna lily is one of my favorite plants. It grows tall. And one of the reasons why I like it because its flowers are not organized, they're not symmetrical. So they have that variance. Each flower looks different to the other one. So I used to pay attention to that plant. The canna lilies were used at one time to plant along the avenues in Guyana.
"13 years separated Carter's Jail Me Quickly from the When time, and given Carter's apparent silence since 1964, it would be fair to wonder if the When time would pick up the anger, the upset, the disappointments that Jail Me Quickly had so devastatingly voiced. Its final poem, from Jail Me Quickly, has this: "Even the round earth is tired of being round and spinning round the sun." Given these final lines, the range then that we find in the When time is astonishing, I think. The zero-sum game of division and disappointment continues to make its mark in Carter's work. But in this poetry, we don't read about the end of the world. Instead, his work gives us examples of how to continue or how to begin again. And one way that he does this in this collection, I think, is to think about children and childhood and the powers of memory. In the poem As When I Was, Carter goes back to childhood experience. The speaker remembers a moment of playing truant in the rain, but freedom is not what he finds, and the perceived strangeness of his surroundings accentuate the boy's fear rather than a sense of independence. I think whenever freedom appears in Carter's poetry, it's often the locus of hope and also potential disappointment. And he searches across his career, I think, for new ways to express that complicated point. In this poem, Carter layers the past, the present, and the future into these two short stanzas. Originally titled As When I Was a Boy, Carter uses memory to think about how to speak. As a boy, fear prevented speech. Now fear paradoxically occasions positive utterance. The poem reads, "I said, I will, I told you." And from positive utterance comes the possibility, maybe, of positive action and a return to the frightening yet magical perspectives of childhood.
As When I Was by Martin Carter. Once, many years ago, decision all my own and truant in the rain, regretting a cheated freedom. Frightened, but not like this, by what was strange yet near me. I tried to speak and could not. Now, frightened into speech by what you could not mean, I said, I will. I told you. And fever came as sudden as when I was a boy, and smell of asphalt burning made grass seem magical.
Before the question. Lightning clips the far night like a pair of blue steel scissors. Thunder rolls in the throat of a toad, glad for the wild rain. And the answer comes before the question. And all I want to do is kneel down before you, hearing it.
Do you know what Martin told me?
Mm-hmm.
He said this poem, he said it just came like the wind. It just came ready. The great dark. Orbiting, the sun itself has a sun, as the moon and earth, a man, a mind. And life is not a matter of a mother only. It is also a question of the probability of the spirit, strength of the web of the ever-weaving weaver. I know not how to speak of, caught as I am, in the great dark of the bright connection of words. And the linked power of love holds the restless wind, even though the sky shudders and life orbits around time, around death. It holds the restless wind, as each might hold each other, as each might hold each other. In the when time of the lost search behind the treasure of the trees rooted an abstract past of a dead seed, in that time is the discovery. Remembrance in the sea or under it, or in a buried casket of drowned flowers. It remains possible to glimpse morning before the sun, possible to see too early where sunset might stain anticipated night. So sudden and so hurting is the bitten tongue of memory.
I do not yet know. Both sunrise and sunset have often been scarlet, and returning noontime, so blue and so white. I do not yet know the name men have given that fluttering yellow and ubiquitous butterfly, whose life is not long, but whose beauty is so startling.
Confound deliberate chaos. Stark and staid dance in mineral air, mastered in the sky. From the plantation's earth, I cry. And it is futile trying to find out now from a housetop or a clock, while canal beside a convent was Amazon to a boy. Besides, just facing about will make what led follow, and what followed lead. And that is again a saying, a raindrop can be a flood, and an ant can be a nation. Stark and stay dance in mineral air, master of the master. Confound deliberate chaos, all calculations.
There was a time when there was a young man in the 1950s who used to walk the streets in Georgetown in short trousers. And his name was Cato. And he would walk the streets backwards, sideways, forwards. He would stand in the middle of the street and then suddenly walk backwards across the traffic. He was never hit. But of course, in those days, we didn't have as much traffic as we do now. But nevertheless, we used to think it was a very dangerous thing for him to do. But he was never injured. And it came to my mind much later on that what Cato was doing was really to demonstrate to us that walking doesn't necessarily mean just walking forward. You can walk in all directions, in any direction that you choose, and that he was doing exactly that. He was showing his command of space in our mind, that thinking is what allows the thoughts in our mind to walk about. We should do that. For a Man Who Walked Sideways by Martin Carter. Proudful and barefoot I stride the street, who wants my shirt can have it. Only the giver gets, the unwanted unwants the world. The bruised heel of his foot kicks like a meteor, and the dim dark behind the blue illusion stands like an altar in a temple in a forsaken land. Having failed to learn how to die, they all perish ungracefully. Lacuan, for all the snakes, struggled well. I suspect that last line, Lacuan, for all the snakes, struggled well, is a reference to people who do not seek to create their own destiny by revolting against what they feel are systems of oppression. Yes. The line that says, only the giver gets, reminds me of the old motto of British Guyana, which says, Damus petimusque vicisssim, Latin for we give and we seek in return.
We walk the streets. All through the supine hours, I heard thunder and lightning, a flick knife in my mind's awkward hand. The blade sharpens the wing of a mosquito. Clear and swift, it cut hours into pieces, and they pile up into history like a bundle of dreams discarded and waiting to be burnt. If you are a beggar, so am I. We walk the streets.
In his concluding review of Poems of Succession, A.J. Seymour quoted in full Martin Carter's 1975 poem, Whence Come They? Seymour thought that riddles and riddling was the defining concern of Poems of Succession, and perhaps because of this, he couldn't resist reading Whence Come They as if it were a riddle to be solved. Seymour writes, among the visitants, poetry has always been waiting on the revolutionary vision and still waits. Similar to Proem and its elusive you, Whence Come They prioritizes an unnamed they and seems to encourage us to discover their identity. But this is not what the questions in the poem demand. Constituted just by two questions and two statements, the poem never explicitly suggests that the identity of the visitants will provide an answer to the poem. A visitant in the 17th century in Europe was simply a visitor, and later it became much more associated with supernatural beings in our English language usage. Carter is interested in asking questions about their origins, the origins of the visitants, and the duration of their presence. Yet he doesn't even answer these questions for us in the poem. Instead, the poem ends with a statement about the need for the expression of gratitude, an expression which the poet cannot fully offer. This deferral of answers and statements that are demanded by the poem might seem quite stubborn, especially when we might think of the poem as being a reply to William Morris's poem, The March of the Workers. The PPP magazine that started in the 1950s got its name from William Morris's poem, Hark the Rolling of the Thunder, we read in that poem. And the poem appeared in a collection called Chants for Socialists. In Whence Come They, Carter's poem, an older Carter revisits maybe the March of the Workers and draws on its diction and its questioning impulse. This is what Morris writes. What is this, the sound, the rumour? What is this that all men hear? Like the wind in hollow valleys when the storm is drawing near, like the rolling on of ocean in the even tide of fear, 'tis the people marching on. Whither go they, and whence come they? What are these of whom ye tell? In what country are they dwelling, twixt the gates of heaven and hell? In quoting directly this archaic sounding phrase, whence come they, from the March of the Workers, Carter could have attuned his poem to what Morris calls in the poem the blended sound of battle and deliverance. But where Morris concentrates on a march to deliverance, Carter registers something more like the silent power of an almost angelic attendance. Whence come they? We might think of as being as socially driven as the March of the Workers, but the unrhymed lines stress patience and the virtues and powers of visitation. We could say that this imagery offers Carter a way to confront the barriers to revolutionary belief. He writes about the deaf ear, the blind eye, the idle hand, and distracted heart. And in writing those lines, we understand the barriers to revolutionary belief without having to sacrifice hope.
Whence come they? Whence come they, these urgent visitants who do not warn of their coming? How long has each been waiting outside this door, this house, this room, silent and invisible, always waiting, always there, impatient and enduring the deaf ear, blind eye, idle hand, and distracted heart? I hardly know how to say thanks, but I'm grateful to be so glad they never went away.